Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. It's been a while, I know. I wasn't actually planning on taking this long to make this video, but here we are. So, today we will be discussing the first ever bestseller, namely Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, written by Samuel Richardson and first published in 1740. It's an oldie. Just oldie. Now, I am using the term first bestseller rather loosely, as historically speaking, that title should probably belong to the Bible, but there is no denying that Pamela was groundbreaking for its time, and it is widely considered to be the first ever English novel. It is a so-called epistolary novel, meaning it's written in the form of letters and diary entries. And quite frankly, it was horribly difficult to get through. It's only about 500 or so pages, but the language used and the way that it's formatted is just frustrating to read. The content itself was quite interesting though, and occasionally even amusing. As always, I will start off this video with a detailed summary of the plot. After that, I will present some reflections I had in my analysis, which will be split into several smaller parts, with all of the timestamps listed below as usual. So without further ado, let's get into it. That's not how you drink tea. This is the story of Pamela Andrews, a young maidservant of 16 years old. She comes from a middle-class background, but her family had been through some tough times which had reduced them to hard labor. Pamela serves in a grand house in Bedfordshire for her master and employer, Mr. B, a 25-or-something-year-old, very handsome bachelor. The story starts off when Mr. B's mother has just passed away, and since Pamela was his mother's servant, things had become quite uncertain for her. As his mother had asked him to take care of young Pamela, he has no intentions of firing her. But it becomes apparent pretty quickly that he has some other, far less innocent intentions for her as well. He starts by teasing her a little bit, by taking a letter that she's been writing and commenting on her writing style. Things like that, which is inappropriate, but not horribly invasive, I suppose. But then we get to the first incident. Mr. B starts making some truly shameless advances at Pamela. He even kisses her quite forcefully and she has to flee the situation. This causes a bit of back and forth where Pamela tells the housekeeper about what happened, and Mr. B gets really angry about this because he clearly cares more about his reputation than he does the well-being of his servants. We get 3 incidents like this in fairly rapid succession, and Pamela is now so terrified of her master that she faints whenever he starts making advances at her. And by advances, I mean physically grabbing her and touching her in inappropriate places. I can't say I blame her for fainting, because his behavior is truly frightening sometimes. Thankfully for Pamela, Mr. B isn't so bad as to actually go through with his intended sexual assault whilst she's unconscious. After she's recovered, however, he expresses his annoyance with Pamela's severe reactions towards his advances because, as he himself puts it, he means her no harm. But Pamela is a pious girl who values her virtue, meaning her virginity, so much that she would rather die than to ever have sexual intercourse ever in her life. Because of this, it's now become impossible for Pamela to stay any longer at his estate. And so she resigns and plans on going back to her parents' house. Now, this is the 1700s, so it's not like she can just catch the next bus out of there. And so it takes her a little while before she actually gets the opportunity to leave. So eventually, she goes with another servant from Mr. B's household who's supposed to go in that direction anyway. But lo and behold, he had been given instructions to take Pamela somewhere completely different. Yes, Mr. B actually ordered someone to kidnap her. This is when we get to Lincolnshire and the story takes on a different format. Previously, the narrative was told through Pamela's letters, but now we get diary entries. Only instead of being divided into many smaller chunks, we get one huge chunk of it. And by huge, I mean, when I started this section of the book, it said, time left in chapter 24 hours and 9 minutes. Did I mention how difficult this book was to read? So anyway, here we are at this large old mansion in Lincolnshire and we meet Mrs. Jukes, who's going to be Pamela's new, let's call it caretaker. We quickly learn that Pamela strongly dislikes Mrs. Jukes as she is apparently mean, fat and ugly. Mr. B has left instructions for Mrs. Jukes on how to take care of Pamela whilst also making sure that she can't escape. Pamela also gets a letter from Mr. B saying something along the lines of, "My intentions towards you are nothing but honourable. And also, can you please write a letter to your father saying you're fine and happy where you are because he came banging on my door demanding to know what happened to you. Thanks." Pamela asks Mrs. Jukes if she's going to help the master in ruining her, because that, and I quote, would be worse than cutting her throat. Mrs. Jukes laughs at this, and I'm actually glad to see that even the author thinks this is rather excessive on Pamela's part. And this is not the first or last time she uses melodrama to make her point. Quite the contrary, in fact. Nothing much really happens here. We continue for a long while hearing of how miserable Pamela is and how much she hates Mrs. Jukes. One thing that I did find rather amusing was that whenever they had an argument, she would punish Pamela by taking away her shoes, because that meant she couldn't go on walks in the garden. I don't know, that just feels so trivial to me. So one kind of plot point that happens here is the introduction of Mr. Williams, a local priest. He takes pity on Pamela and her situation and decides to try and help her. They start a secret correspondence by hiding letters from each other in the garden, and he agrees to help her escape the mansion. The interesting thing here is that he explains in his letters that the best way for him to truly help her would be to marry her. Pamela disagrees with this as she has no feelings for him and has no wish to marry at all, but her standpoint is just kind of glossed over, which just demonstrates the sad times that these characters live in, to be honest. But before the rescue plan can be put into action, Mr. Williams gets into a fair amount of trouble. On his way home after a visit at the mansion one night, he is robbed, assaulted, thrown into a dam where he nearly drowns, and once he's recovered from these injuries, he's arrested and thrown in jail. Now, can you possibly guess who might have been responsible for these misfortunes? Mr. B is furious and overcome with jealousy. He sends Pamela an angry letter saying that she's hurt his honor and pride, and that he's intent on having his revenge on her. He will make sure that everything that she fears will indeed happen, and more. But his revenge will have to wait 3 weeks, as he has a hunting trip to go on first. Poor Pamela is now determined she has to try and escape by herself. She manages to get out of the locked room one night and even gets out into the garden, but not getting past the closed gate, she tries to climb it. Unsurprisingly, this doesn't go very well, as Pamela's overall physique is kind of frail, certainly not strong enough to carry her own weight. Desperate, she believes that there is only one solution left, and this is actually a really sad moment. She contemplates drowning herself in the garden pond because, as has been stated many times throughout the book, her virtue is more important to her than her life. But as she gets closer to the pond, she realizes how unreasonable this is and ultimately decides against it, holding on to the hope that she will be able to get out of the situation somehow. So after her escape attempt, she is put under much higher supervision to make sure that she doesn't try and escape again. She is now forced to sleep in the same bed as both Mrs. Jukes and another servant named Nan. Shortly afterwards, they are brought the news that Mr. B had an accident on his hunting trip and nearly died. But Pamela is still glad to hear that her master is safe, which is another testimony to her flawlessly good character. So now we finally get to the point where Mr. B arrives at the Lincolnshire mansion. Pamela is terrified, thinking that he's going to act on all of those threats in his letters, and as soon as he enters her room, she throws herself on the floor, crying and begging him to let her be. This seems to work, as he actually does leave her alone and doesn't call for her again until later. His behavior, though, is still, unfortunately, very much inappropriate. He continues to tease and kiss her, and when she struggles, he threatens her some more, because why not? At this point, however, it's become quite clear to the reader that Mr. B is not, in fact, a rapist. And no matter how inappropriate he is not going to act on those threats. The following day, he comes to her with an offer. He wants her to become his official mistress, and in return, she would get a large sum of money, her own estate, plenty of diamond jewelry, and he would also make sure that her family is well taken care of. He also explains here how important it is for him that she gives in by her own free will. It is quite a generous proposal, but Pamela rejects it, of course. Nothing is more important to her than her virtue. Then he makes an addition to this offer. If she agrees to be his mistress for 1 year and everything goes well, he will marry her. She still refuses, however, and he is now growing desperate. Shortly thereafter, Mr. B goes away to Stamford to sort out all this nasty business with Mr. Williams. As her master is now away for a few days, Pamela is lulled into a false sense of security. One night, Nan, the other servant sleeping in the same bed as them, has a bit too much sherry to drink. And so she goes to bed early. And when Pamela and Mrs. Jukes comes to join her a bit later, they find Nan asleep in a chair in the dark corner of the room. Pamela wants to wake her, but Mrs. Jukes tells her to let her be. And so they start getting ready for bed whilst having some idle chit-chat. Once they are in bed, Nan gets up from the chair and goes to join them. But surprise, surprise, it is not Nan. It is Mr. B, dressed in Nan's nightgown and petticoat. I can barely say that with a straight face. He rushes for Pamela quite aggressively and shouts at her that he will take her by force if she doesn't agree to his proposals. This is all too much for Pamela's sensitive nature, and so she faints again. The following day, Mr. B has a different attitude towards her. He's tender and he keeps a distance she's actually comfortable with. He asks if she would give her consent to stay willingly at the mansion for 2 more weeks, and by doing thus, she will be given more freedom. This is such a strange question, because who wouldn't consent to that if it meant you'll be getting your freedom back? That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, Pamela does consent to this, but she gets suspicious very quickly when she overhears Mr. B and Mrs. Jukes talking. And he says that if he can't get to her using fear and threats, then he will get to her with kindness. Becoming quite manipulative there, Mr. B. And indeed, his behavior towards her changes a lot after this. They take serene little garden walks together, talking and getting to know each other. Pamela is on her guard though, and eventually they have an argument about his intentions. He gets aggravated and admits that his love for her is genuine and true, and that he loves her even more for her honesty and virtue. He admits to this being a bit of a predicament and asks her true opinion of what he should do in this situation. His sudden openness and emotion here makes Pamela fear that she might actually start to care for him. He asks her whether it would ever be possible for her to actually love him, but she can't give him an answer. He doesn't press her, however, and instead he admits to having felt more pleasure during this sincere conversation than ever before in her company. After this, Mr. B goes away for a few days to attend a ball. During his absence, a message finds its way to Pamela's hands from an unknown source. It tells her that she is in danger, that Mr. B plans on arranging a fake wedding for them, that he's even hired some attorney to play the part of minister. So naturally, this has Pamela very worried. This is also when Mrs. Jukes finds some of Pamela's hidden diary entries, and she hands those over to Mr. B as soon as he's returned. He reads them and he enjoys them so much that he asks for the continuation, as that was only one part of the story. Pamela is very reluctant because those papers are actually sewed into her petticoat. Mr. B is not stupid and quickly realizes that she has them on her somewhere and begins to tease her about stripping her until he finds them. This, of course, makes her more compliant and she goes to take them out for him. She hands them over in the garden the following day and he reads them in her presence. This is the part where she has written about her escape attempt, and he is greatly moved by how she contemplated drowning herself to get away from him. He is overcome with guilt and he vows to make amends for all the hurts that he has caused her, even if it means going against the rules of the society he belongs to. This strongly implies that he is talking about marriage. And Pamela, being worried about the secret note she had been given, replies that her only wish is to return to her parents. Mr. B gets visibly upset by this and commands her to leave him. He then immediately orders some servants to get the carriage ready and tells them to bring her home to her parents. She has less than an hour to prepare for this journey, and she is actually quite shocked at this reaction from him. It is not without a kind of sadness that Pamela then leaves the mansion, which surprised her to say the least. While on the road, Pamela and the groomsmen that came with her had to take lodgings at a village inn before resuming their journey the next day. Pamela is strangely conflicted. She realizes that her feelings for Mr. B must have been sneaking up on her for a while now, especially since he became more kind towards her. And the act of letting her go, despite this going against his own feelings, seems to have done the trick. In other words, she realizes that she has fallen in love. Whilst they are staying at this inn, another groomsman arrives from Mr. B's mansion. He carries a letter from his master to Pamela, saying that he regrets sending her away, and if she could find it in her heart to return to him, then she would have all of her liberty back and she can come and go as she pleases. So she accepts, and off she goes back to the mansion and her great love, Mr. B. He is overjoyed at her return and treats her with kindness and respect. Then we find out that a letter has arrived from Mr. B's sister, Lady Davers. In this letter, she reproaches him for kidnapping their late mother's maidservant and demands him to let her go. She also addresses the troubling rumors that Mr. B is actually considering marrying her. Lady Davers was very much appalled at this, to put it lightly, and Pamela was even a bit provoked reading it, as it was very condescending and hurtful towards her. Because of this letter, Pamela decides to tell Mr. B about having heard of him arranging some sort of fake wedding for them. He comes clean, saying that he did actually plan that at some point, but eventually abandoned the idea. She kind of believes him, I don't know. She doesn't really press the issue anymore after this. Partly because she gets distracted, as Mr. B has invited some friends to come and visit them at the mansion, and he asks Pamela if she can be introduced to them. She feels really awkward about this and doesn't really want to, but he persuades her. So, a few things happen around this part of the story. The first is that Mr. B insists on knowing everything that went on between Mr. Williams and Pamela, and he is incredibly jealous about it. Pamela insists that she never encouraged Mr. Williams and never wanted his attentions. She only ever wanted his help in escaping the mansion. Mr. B then demands to see the first part of her diary, as it relays the first couple of weeks there. Unfortunately, though, these have been sent to her parents, and Mr. B sends some servants. There's a lot of servant sending in this novel. So Mr. B sends some servants to go and get them. Then he goes on to talk about marriage, and that Pamela can choose a wedding date for them as long as it is within the next 2 weeks. Pamela chooses as far back as she can, as she's very overwhelmed at the idea and wants to slow things down. But Mr. B isn't having any of that. He's found his great love and now he wants to marry her. The discussion is put on hold, however, as it's time for his friends to come and visit. Naturally, they are all very wealthy, high-class people, and it's easy to think that they're going to dislike the idea of Mr. B marrying his mother's servant. Well, that's not exactly how it goes. They all adore Pamela. They find her sweet, beautiful, and accomplished. What more can you ask for? It's actually a little disturbing how quick they are to accept this. I couldn't help but wonder if the only reason why they would be so supportive was because of Mr. B's wealth and influence, and they didn't want to lose him as their friend. As all of this was going on, we get an unexpected visitor at the mansion. Pamela's father is here, and he is overcome with grief over the rumors he's heard about the foul Mr. B having ravaged his poor daughter. Mr. B is quite cheerful, however, and he calmly informs him that he plans on marrying his daughter in about 12 days' time. As you can probably imagine, Mr. Andrews is very much surprised by this, but he accepts it and he spends the next couple of days hanging out with them, expressing his gratitude to Mr. B as often as he can. It's actually kind of jarring sometimes. Eventually, though, he has to leave to get back to Pamela's poor mother, who still doesn't know anything about what's going on. So away he goes again. The mansion has a little chapel that is now being prepared and cleaned up for the wedding ceremony. Mr. B is pressing Pamela to pick a date that is sooner, but she's stalling. She's really overwhelmed and wants to prepare herself mentally for what is to come. The following days before the wedding are kind of uneventful. Mr. B's friends come back for another visit. They have a Sunday sermon in the chapel. They meet Mr. Williams again, and Mr. B is quite proud to dangle Pamela in front of him like some sort of prize he failed to win. They also get another reproaching letter from Mr. B's sister, Lady Davers, only this time it was signed Lord Davers. But Mr. B knew it was his sister's words, and he gets annoyed with her for using her titled ape of a husband to try and get her point across. It's pretty clear that Lady Davers will come to be a problem for them later on. Pamela has mixed feelings at this point. She hates the fact that she is the reason behind Mr. B and his sister quarreling. And she also has this growing fear inside her that not being good enough for Mr. B and that he's going to tire of her shortly after their wedding. Her sense of unworthiness makes her agree on some of Lady Davers' viewpoints, despite Mr. B being very reassuring and loving towards her. And it's finally wedding time. Pamela is incredibly tense and nervous, and Mr. B is all happiness and tries to calm her down with sweet talk. But when that doesn't work, he simply tells her to try and be more cheerful, otherwise people might think that she would rather marry someone else. She goes through the ceremony trembling with both joy and fear. It was a small, private ordeal as they wanted to keep it a secret for a little while so that no one would try and put a stop to it. Specifically Lady Davers. The wedding night comes and goes, and we as readers are left to assume that the happy couple have now consummated their marriage. There is no mention of it in Pamela's diary. A bit anticlimactic, but it is the 1700s after all. A few days go by after the wedding, and Pamela gets increasingly comfortable with Mr. B. She even starts to see the benefits of her new position, that she will be able to do so much more good for those less fortunate in society. They have a long and slightly odd conversation about their schedules as a married couple, like what time they shall both rise in the morning and what times they will have their meals. It's quite boring, but also strangely realistic somehow. A couple of days later, Mr. B has to leave to go and visit a friend of his who's on his deathbed. Again, it's the 1700s. He ends up staying the night there, but he sends Pamela a letter asking her to meet him at another friend's house the following evening for a dinner party. During his absence, Pamela gets a surprise visit from none other than Lady Davers. And she's also brought her young nephew and a maidservant with her. Pamela is frightened by the sudden sight of this furious woman, but she is no match for the strong-willed lady and is forced to receive her in the parlor. Lady Davers wastes no time. She questions Pamela about her relationship with Mr. B and even asks her point blank whether they've slept together. Despite this heavy interrogation, Pamela carries herself with dignity. She claims she is still an honest woman and tries to leave, but Lady Davers puts a chair in front of the door and sits down in it. Trust me, the drama has only just begun. Lady Davers then offers to take Pamela with her to her house for her to live and work, and when Pamela rejects this, she then offers to take her back to her parents' house. But she rejects this as well. Then the lady finally spots the ring on her finger and tells her she's been tricked into a fake marriage. She asks her whether she believes her marriage is indeed real, but Pamela replies that it doesn't matter what she says, as Lady Davers will still think whatever she wants. At this sassy comment, Lady Davers slaps her on the cheek. Pamela tries desperately to leave the room, but this time the lady's nephew draws his sword halfway, causing Pamela to get so frightened she's about to faint, and Mrs. Jukes comes running with her smelling salts. Once she's come to, Pamela sees the carriage waiting for her as she's supposed to go and meet Mr. B. Seizing the opportunity, she escapes through an open window, running as fast as she can to the carriage. Once arrived at the other house, she tells Mr. B about the surprise visit from his sister. He then asks her 2 questions, the first one being, did she hit you? And secondly, whether Lady Davers was actually so rude as to not have lunch with her. Because those two are clearly equivalent to each other. Once he realizes the severity of the situation, he promises to make it up to her. After an evening of dining and socializing, the couple returns to the mansion where Lady Davers has now gone to sleep. The morning after, however, the lady wakes up with renewed fury and marches into their bedroom shouting threats at poor Pamela. But Mr. B wasn't having any of it, and he proceeded to lift his sister, carry her out of the room, and shutting the door in her face. He then has to spend the day dealing with his sister's anger and convince her that they are indeed married. Despite her continuous insults towards Pamela, he's actually very patient with her and tries really hard to change her attitude. That is, until she takes it one step too far. Lady Davers takes on a different approach and starts hinting towards Pamela that she doesn't really know the man she married, that he's hiding some terrible secrets. This forces him to tell of a few things in his past that he isn't particularly proud of. The first thing was some kind of duel in Italy where he believes his opponent had died because of the injuries he got from him. The other was him having seduced a young woman named Sally Godfrey, whom had given in to his advances because she thought he might want to marry her, which of course he never intended to. Mr. B gets upset with his sister for forcing him to share his darkest secrets under these circumstances, and he storms off. The women catch up to him, however, and they all talk it out. That evening, Lady Davers and Mr. B go to dine with his friends, but Pamela stays behind to write in her diary. When they get back, Lady Davers has much changed her attitude towards Pamela, as she's heard so many good things about her from her brother's friends, people of high status whose opinions she respects. Mr. B and Pamela go on to have a strangely modern conversation about the misunderstandings they've had and how to avoid having more of those in the future. We get a very honest account of Mr. B's upbringing and how he was raised without any boundaries or restraint. This has forced him to become far too entitled and self-righteous, and it's partly why he acts the way he does. He's never really been denied anything, and he makes a point that any children that they have will need to be raised differently, that they will need to be restrained rather than indulged. We're nearing the end of the story, but we are not done yet with the surprises. Arrangements are made for Mr. B and Pamela to go back to the Bedfordshire house, and they part ways with Lady Davers, who is now very sweet and accepting towards Pamela. Not much is said of their journey, and they arrive at a house full of servants excited to see the newlyweds. Mr. B arranges with his secretary for an allowance to be paid to Pamela every 3 months, kind of like her pocket money. And Pamela is excited to use this money to do some charitable work. Soon after their arrival at the house, Mr. B takes Pamela out one morning to a milk farm close by. This place is known for their excellent breakfast, and apparently he and his wealthy neighbors are frequent visitors there. As they are enjoying their breakfast, a group of little girls arrive from a nearby orphanage. Mr. B is very sweet with them, and he has a familiar manner with one girl in particular, a 6-year-old child who happens to call him uncle. Discreetly, Pamela asks Mr. B who this girl is, and her suspicions are immediately confirmed. She is Mr. B's illegitimate daughter with the poor woman Sally Godfrey. Sally had apparently fled from her shame soon after giving birth and started a new life in Jamaica. So Mr. B took it upon himself to make sure his daughter had a good and safe upbringing, although keeping her true origins a secret to the outside world. Pamela is strangely delighted at this, and she begs Mr. B to let the girl move in with them. She feels confident that she will love and care for this child like her own. Mr. B finds this very touching, but he doesn't agree to this right away and says that he will have to think about it. Some days go by after this event, and Mr. B spends a lot of time working in his library. During an afternoon walk, he tells Pamela that he's been working on securing an independence for her in the event of his death. This was actually very sweet of him, as it was quite common back then for women of fortune to be turned out of their own homes as soon as their husbands died. So the story wraps up quite nicely with the knowledge that Pamela is financially secure for the rest of her life. And even her parents are given their own estate from Mr. B. We don't exactly know if Mr. B ever agreed to them taking in his illegitimate daughter. At least I don't think so. But yeah, apart from that, everyone is happy, and that is the end of the story. So, another day, another hairstyle, another outfit. Let's continue. I want to start the discussion off by highlighting the relationship between Pamela and Mr. B. The thing is, I find it both dysfunctional and disturbing, as well as interesting, and I'm going to explain why. If we start at the beginning, we see Mr. B trying to seduce Pamela. This is a horrifying situation, both from her perspective as well as for us as readers. In our case, it's not necessarily the thought of premarital sex that frightens us, but rather the thought of being used by your employer for their own selfish needs. This is unfortunately still a reality even today for many people around the world, and thus we can relate to Pamela's dilemma on a more human level. Given the time period though, things are a bit more extreme here. It is clear that Mr. B sees Pamela as nothing more than his servant, and by extension his property. He is rich and privileged, and he can do whatever he wants with his property. This is why he never even asks for her consent. He automatically assumes that she's going to give in to his advances. And when she doesn't, he takes it personally and acts as though she's the one who's doing something wrong. In other words, he's gaslighting her. The lack of regard for Pamela's own feelings is a persistent pattern throughout the story, and despite her elevation from servant to wife, this doesn't really change. And it's not only Mr. B who's the culprit here. No one seems to care about Pamela's own wishes. For example, when she doesn't want to marry Mr. Williams. Neither he nor Mrs. Jukes, not even her own parents, can understand why she won't accept his offer. It's nice living in the city, isn't it? The ironic thing here is that Mr. Williams is a priest, thereby being a man of the church, and thus should probably be a little bit more considerate. But instead he attaches himself to the idea Thank you. But instead he attaches himself to the idea of having Pamela for his wife and kind of forgets why he's even helping her in the first place. Anyway, back to Mr. B. The fact that he thought that he had the right to read Pamela's diary is absolutely sickening to me. If we as individuals can't have our own thoughts and feelings private, or at least choose who we share them with, then what do we have really? By exerting his power over her in this way, he is breaking all of the barriers and forcing himself into her most personal space. And I have a difficult time getting over that. Again, it shows how unequal these two people are, that he is and always will be her master. When looking at the historical context, husbands were the masters of their wives both legally and socially speaking. But this situation takes things even further. He literally owns her. She is his property. It's actually quite painful to see this relationship develop because, well, now I can't say that word without overthinking it. Because despite Pamela's rise in status as she gets married, he still orders her around. He is incredibly manipulative, and he only makes it look like she has a choice. If he for some reason agrees with something that she wants, he always finds a way to change it later. Take the wedding date, for example. He says that she's free to pick the date, and yet he restricts her choice by saying it has to be within the next 2 weeks. But then he tries to restrict it even further by saying he wants her to pick a date out of the first week out of those 2 weeks. Another example is when Mr. B has his friends over at the mansion. He tells them about a poem that Pamela had written in her diary and tells Pamela to recite it for them. She is mortified and rightfully refuses to do so, as, once again, her diary was never really meant to be enjoyed by neither him nor his guests. Despite her objections, Mr. B goes on to recite the poem himself, and this is a good example of his lack of respect for her and her feelings. I think I've made my point on the dysfunctional and disturbing aspect of this relationship. Now, let's talk about what makes it interesting. One thing that Mr. B does value in Pamela is her free will and regard for him. Having never been refused anything throughout his life up until that point, he doesn't really know how to handle the situation when Pamela refuses his advances. It becomes an obsession for him. He has to have her, and she has to want it. This was the ultimate challenge for him, in a way. But then he gets hold of her diary, and he finds himself looking at the situation from another point of view, quite literally. And he doesn't like what he sees. His giant ego forces him to continue reading despite how negatively he's portrayed. This new perspective triggers a change in him, and he becomes more sympathetic towards Pamela. This in turn allows him to feel more genuine emotions, starting with tremendous guilt for causing so much pain and misery for her. I honestly believe that he did fall in love with her at this point. Or at least the kind of love that fits his narrow view of relationships in general. From the point of their wedding, he claims many times that it was her looks that made him want her, but her mind that made him marry her. And there is a good amount of sincerity in this statement. Mr. B is actually a fairly complex character, and despite his numerous flaws, he has some redeeming qualities. Before the whole ordeal with Pamela started, he had refused several potential wives and had pretty much decided on remaining a bachelor. He was frightened of commitment and would look at his married friends with disdain. He also felt like the women in his society were too shallow and simple-minded, and what he required from a relationship was a deeper connection of both mind and heart. Yes, the now very famous not like other girls trope has apparently been a thing since the 1740s. And to his great surprise, he found himself opening up to this opportunity by reading Pamela's diary. It's because of his past beliefs and behavior that his decision to marry Pamela is so important. It signifies personal growth and that he has learned to see a woman's value beyond her pretty looks. But it remains a question whether Mr. B is actually capable of that true deep connection he so craves, or if his own ego and sense of entitlement will always stand in the way. Now that we've spent some time discussing Mr. B, let's move our attention towards Pamela. As I was reading, it became clear to me pretty early on that something wasn't right about Pamela. It was like I was told one thing and then I was shown something different. What I mean by this is that Pamela is supposed to be a servant, and yet she speaks and behaves like a lady. She never actually does any servant's work, but rather fancy work like embroidery, something which high-class and middle-class ladies also occupy themselves with. Her speech is on par with that of Mr. B and the other wealthy characters, and she's learned many other ladylike things from being Mr. B's mother's maidservant. In fact, I wouldn't even have called her a maid, but rather the old lady's personal pet project. She was taught how to dance. She was taught how to dance and play instruments and engage in high society conversation and card games. And since Pamela had been in their service since she was about 11 years old, you could say that she's practically been brought up to be Mr. B's wife. A little disturbing, but still. All of this automatically makes Pamela fit in with the wealthy characters much more than she does with the servants. And this is actually highly deliberate. In an earlier version of the story, Pamela had a more working-class accent. But many of the high and middle-class ladies who read it didn't like that. And as they were the intended target audience, Richardson made sure to change that. He also changed Pamela's origins from being working-class background at first to having educated middle-class parents who had just happened to fall on hard times. So, for a man of Mr. B's wealth and status, it would have been considered very inappropriate to marry your late mother's maidservant. A contemporary reader would have found this a controversial topic, and it was very difficult for them to digest this. So therefore, Richardson had to find a way to bridge the gap, to make his intended audience warm up to Pamela and accept her as Mr. B's love interest. I would say that he did succeed with this, but I can't help but feel like it cost him the artistic integrity of his story. Times are different now. In today's day and age, we tend to read books with a more analytical eye. It's not just for enjoyment anymore. Literature is a science all in itself, and when we apply these analytical concepts, we see the flaws of Pamela bright and clear, both the book as well as the character. But despite this, I can't really judge it too harshly. As previously stated, Pamela is widely considered to be the first English novel, and when you remind yourself of that, it becomes a lot easier to forgive Pamela for its flaws. Don't we just love messages of morality in our fiction? You know, carefully constructed lessons on how we should live our lives by resisting temptation, forsake all riches, and always remain pious and sweet-tempered. Because if we don't do all of those things, shame and misfortune will surely strike us. Pamela meets with temptation quite early on in the story by Mr. B's advances. She has no problem resisting this though, as he's being quite obnoxious and creepy. But, historically speaking, that wasn't always so simple. As we see in Mr. B's proposals to Pamela, being a kept mistress had its perks. But they also had a lot to lose, of course. They could, for instance, get pregnant and or being cast out of the house for some reason. And a pregnant, unmarried woman was forever branded as a harlot, pretty much. Regardless of the temptation of what they might have to gain from the liaison, let's not forget that immaturity in age paired with physical attraction might also play a part in this. Remember, Pamela is only 16 and Mr. B is a handsome young man after all. So Samuel Richardson takes it upon himself to teach the young unmarried women in his audience to guard themselves against temptations of this kind. When Pamela is kidnapped and asks Mr. Williams to help her escape, he praises her for resisting Mr. B's efforts to sleep with her. This is then mentioned many times throughout the book how unusual Pamela is for her perseverance, how rare it is to find someone so pure and honest. So, in a way, it serves as a kind of social commentary where the author can point out how awful it is that so many people have premarital sex. The whole book, even the title, is nothing but one huge lesson on the importance of innocence and virtue. One could argue that this is part of the reason for its immense popularity. That people could enjoy reading Pamela both as a guilty pleasure as well as a socially accepted form of entertainment. This, in turn, would help pave the way for another genre of literature, one that would become increasingly popular throughout the latter half of the 18th century: conduct books for young women. Granted, this topic deserves a video all on its own, but it is essentially a whole genre dedicated to teaching young girls and women on how to behave, how to get a husband, and how to be a good wife and mother. It's not very difficult to see how Pamela could have acted as a precursor to the conduct books of the era, and therefore I had to include this little anecdote here. Pamela had a great influence on the development of the novel, and I can see why. The first-person POV we get in her letters and diary entries lets you in on Pamela's private thoughts and feelings, thus making a reader care about her. Although I think a contemporary reader would probably find her more relatable than we do today. After all, relating to fictional characters with human emotions and flaws is part of why people love reading. So let's start off this section by talking about the main characters. Pamela is, in my opinion, the least likable of all the characters. She is pious and selfless to the point of farce, and she goes from being annoying and naive to being wise and well-mannered with a disturbing irregularity. If anything, Mr. B feels a lot more real. At least he realizes what a terrible person he's been for trying to seduce and abuse Pamela, and he even wants to spend the rest of his life making up for it. Humans make mistakes, and humans usually learn from those mistakes. Pamela doesn't make any mistakes, however. She's portrayed as the morally perfect angel throughout the whole novel. She is what we call a Mary Sue, a flawless character, while Mr. B goes from being a despicable creep to a fairly decent guy. It's because of this kind of redemption arc that I can't help but like his character the most. Another thing that is very disappointing about Pamela is that her character development is all related to her relationship with Mr. B. I think this is something that many of us writers still do today, to not make our characters deep enough to stand on their own, but their traits only come through when they interact with the other characters. My second point is that of pacing. The funny thing about pacing is that when it's balanced and good, you don't really think about it, but when it's unbalanced or off in some way, it kind of ruins your reading experience. That is partially why this book took me forever to finish. Because every little conversation would just go on and on and on for page after page after page without reaching any sort of conclusion or leading to any plot points. Quite frankly, I was incredibly bored throughout 75% of this book. And when you get bored, you lose interest. And that is why good pacing is so crucial to any story. And then, of course, something insane happens, like when Mr. B tried to abuse Pamela, or when Lady Davers came to the house in a furious frenzy. All of a sudden, the pacing is really fast, and you feel like, okay, something is finally happening, but then it all just slows down again. Like in the scene with Lady Davers, for example. She's interrogating Pamela very harshly, but despite her anger and all the drama that's going on, things are moving at a very slow pace. Pamela is stuck with her in the parlor for hours, and it really feels like it too. The conversation isn't going anywhere, it's all going in circles. Lady Davos is asking the same questions over and over again, and there's no conclusion to anything. If I were to write a scene like this, I would have made it much more fast-paced to keep the reader at the edge of their seats. One author that I am fairly certain would agree with me in this is none other than Jane Austen. There is actually one scene in my favorite Jane Austen novel, Pride and Prejudice, that is very similar to the Lady Davos scene. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't read it, but it involves the heroine Elizabeth Bennet and a wealthy family member of her love interest. It is still a fairly long conversation, but it is over and done with in little more than 6 pages, which is far more reasonable for a dramatic scene like this, in my opinion. It is known for a fact that Jane Austen did read Samuel Richardson. His last book in particular is said to have been among her favorites. I'll have to read it before I believe it, I think. Moving on to the next point in this section. Setup and payoff. A crucial tool to any storyteller is to plant little hints or do a bit of foreshadowing for plot points that will come into play later. This is the setup, and then you have the payoff, when all of those hints lead to some kind of dramatic conclusion or something along those lines. This is where I want to talk about the fake wedding. All the clues were there. First of all, we have the warning note to Pamela, and then we have Mr. B really pushing to have the wedding as quickly as possible and wanting to keep it a secret. And then we have his friends who are being overly supportive, as if they were all just pretending to like her. It all just seemed too suspicious. All of these hints were dropped throughout the whole book, pretty much, and they didn't lead anywhere. We got to the point where Pamela finally confronts Mr. B about the fake wedding, and he's just like, yeah, I did plan that at some point, but I changed my mind. And then that was it. At this point, I was still convinced that something wasn't right about this. And then when Lady Davos came into the picture saying that Pamela had been tricked, I was like, aha, I knew it. But then that didn't lead anywhere either. This annoyed me so much. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, someone in here is not telling the truth. I'm inclined to think it's Mr. B, but who even knows at this point? So, now we've talked about a few things that I've noticed whilst reading Pamela from a writer's perspective. There are, of course, more things, as there always are, but I think this video has gone on for long enough. Also, it literally took me forever to make this video. Sometimes life really makes things difficult for you. I will do my very best to get the next one out a bit quicker though. Now, what I would like to know is, have you yourself read Pamela? What did you think of it? Do you agree or disagree with any of my thoughts? Or if you have any other thoughts or feelings about the content of this video in general, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you enjoy my content, then you can make my day by subscribing to my channel and giving me a thumbs up. Niles and I thank you so much for watching today, and we hope to see you back next time.